So we're going to look at curves, and we're going to look at how they're used for tone remapping and how we can use curves to manipulate RGB channels. So when we're talking about curves and we're talking about adjusting the RGB channels, we're talking specifically about changing or adjusting the tonal range of the image. Now the tonal range refers to the brightness and darkness of the pixels and the forms and the shapes within an image, and sometimes you'll see this referred to as lightness or luminosity or value. We can see a tonal range very clearly in a black and white image because all we can see is light and dark. There's no chroma or hues in there. And we can see the Adams image on the top right where we can clearly see plenty of blacks, we can see whites, and we can see all of the grey areas in between. So we tend to break up tonal ranges into kind of categories. The blacks, and then we'll have the shadows, which would be the kind of the dark grey of the rock here. Then we might have the highlights, which might be this part of the sky, and then the whites, which would be literally white and colours very close to white. Now, even though it's clear to see here, it's no different in color images where we have lightness and darkness, but we also have chroma differences, or blue and red and green evident here. So the Joker image would be a low-key image, so we can see that the tonal range is kind of down around the blacks, the shadows and the highlights, but there's nothing very bright in there to indicate that there's a very wide tonal range. So we're going to be looking at curves as a way of changing and manipulating the tonal ranges in black and white and color. So what are curves used for? They're used for color correcting. They're used in nearly all video applications and graphic applications like Photoshop, Premiere, After Effects, and so on. So curves could be used in an aesthetic way to change the look of your images if you want to, give your image more contrast or change the color slightly. They're very effective, they're a very quick, intuitive way of working once you get your head around them. But they're also integral in the compositing process where we need to change certain images to be used to create transparency and things like that. Now, in a technical level, a curve is a graph. We can see here an example of a curve in After Effects where we have a box, we have a couple of grid lines, and we have a diagonal line here, which is in fact our curve. Now this is referred to as a lookup table because we can look up values specifically related in this case to tones. So when we use curves, we're primarily interested in remapping tones from one value to another. Okay, now it helps when you're learning about curves to understand how the curve is actually set up and displayed as a tool. So if you look at the grid or the box here, it has an x-axis, it has a y-axis, and you can think of the image being changed by the curve from an input or a before to an output or an after. So all of the darkest parts of the image as it comes into the effect will be down here towards the left, where we have our bottom left corner representing black or 0% tone. On the right hand side you'll have pure white or 100% tone, and we'll have everything in between, but they're broken up here for simplicity into 0, 25, 50, 75 and 100. So down here we could see all of the tones in our image from the darkest to the lighter as it's coming into the effect, and then the output is the same. What tones will it have once the curve has been applied, and that is related to how we change this curve. So we can see here an example of a curve, simple curve adjustment, where again we have our unaffected curve here, 0, 25, 50, 75 and 100, and the curve is perfectly diagonal, so we can see that 0 on the input maps to 0 on the output, 25% grey on the input, or the before is still 25% grey on the out. Similarly with 50, 75 and 100. If we change the curve, if we drag it in a particular way, in this case I've dragged it down onto that line, what was 50% grey on the input has now been mapped to 25% grey on the output, which means that it is a darker image. We can quickly pop into After Effects just to show that. So here we have the curve applied as an effect to our Toy Story image, and if I click and I drag that down, everything that was 50% tone or brightness will now become 25% on the output, but obviously everything else on that curve along that portion there has also come down proportionally from the original state. So the changing it from 50 to 25 is just to illustrate the point of how the curve works, but it's every single point on the curve has now been remapped. So you can see here that 25% grey is down at roughly 10%. Okay, so the curve changes or remaps all of our input tones to a different output tone. So if I drag that up, our 50 now becomes 75, but we also have a change in all of the remapped tones up here and here. So using the curves is simple enough. We just click and drag. And if you have a point that you want to get rid of, you just throw it away. You click and drag off to the right or the left, and the point will disappear. So we have, an infinite amount of ways that we can change this curve, but there are a number of conventional curve changes that you can make that will give you very predictable results. Now, I don't want to imply that these are the only things that you can do. These are just a starting off point, but everything that you do will be some variation of this, or you'll be doing something like this but more or less, or you'll be possibly even combining one or two of these. Okay, now back into After Effects for a moment, and just to point out that the curve, the default curve, the white diagonal line, means that we're changing the brightness of the entire image, but specifically that is because we are changing the red, the green and the blue channels together. So we're not changing the proportion of red, green or blue, so we don't get any hue changes. We can, if we want, select a channel and you'll see it pop up in its own color there, so that if we were to change that, it would only be changing the value on that curve. And I'll come back to that towards the end of this video, but just to stress the point now that we are talking about RGB tonal changes, which means that the entire pixel will become lighter or darker and not just one of its channels. So the first one we can look at is called the S-curve, and you'll see it's called an S-curve because of the shape that it takes. Now an S-curve is used for creating contrast because we're taking the darker parts of the image. In this case we'll take the 25% input and we'll drag it down to about half that value. You'll see the dark parts get darker, well, everything gets darker, but if I drag that up, you'll see that now the lightest parts get lighter. So if the lighter parts are lighter, darker parts are darker, it has the equivalent of being a high contrast image. So the S-curve is sometimes called a high con or high contrast curve. So I'll reset that, pop back out, see that the next one is. So the next one is like an inside out or an upside down S-curve, and it's used for flattening out the tones in your image. There's two ways you could do this, and I'll show you both now. So the first way is the way that I showed in the PowerPoint, where instead of dragging down for contrast, I drag up and then I drag down, and I get a kind of a inside out S. So this is one way of doing it. You'll see that there is no contrast now. All of the tones are kind of squashed in towards the middle and flattened out on the 25%. If I reset that, I can show you another way of doing it, where you just drag the bottom corners, the top corners of your curve, and you create a more linear, straightforward flattening. If you were to go all the way to 50 and all the way to 50, all of your tones are now mapped to 50% grey, which means we don't have an image anymore. So reset that, pop back out, and we'll see the next one. So the next one is what is called a destructive effect, in that we're actually going to change the brightest part of our image so that where we used to have detail in the highlights, we're now going to clip that and make it all white. So this is done quite often in compositing, where we need to change what's called our matte image to make it more flat white, but you don't want to be doing this regularly with images because you will lose information. So if we look at the outside the window here, it's hard to see, but there is a slight variation there in terms of, you can see a little bit of the blue sky kind of poking through the clouds. There's a couple of slight subtle variations in our white area. If I drag this to the left, all of that detail gets flattened out and is now made white. If I switch off the effect, you'll see it. Now sometimes you want to do this, it's a creative thing, you want to make something look very kind of blown out and white and dreamy, but you have to realize that where you used to have detail around here, it's now all white. Now the opposite of that is to take our black point and change the output so that everything from 0 to 25% is now flatlining at 0%. So we don't have any shadows now, we just have black where the shadows should be, and all of our detail is contained from the 25 to the 100% tonal range. The next one we'll look at is called a gamma correction, and this is similar to these two in that it lightens and darkens, but it doesn't clip or crush the blacks, and we don't lose any detail. And to do that, we're actually doing the first thing we did, where we just clicked and dragged in the middle. So notice we're darkening it, but we're not pushing any of these shadow points down to black. We're not pushing any of these highlights up to white. Everything still has some bit of detail in it, because we can see that it goes from black to white, but it doesn't clip either of those. So we have a non-destructive way of lightening and darkening the mid ranges of our tones. So this is a very common way of adjusting for something that's slightly under or overexposed. If you're shooting, or if you've produced something in software and it's a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright, this is a way of doing it without losing any detail. Following this, we have what's called linear lightening and linear darkening. So they're linear because we don't have a curve, and they're very simple and effective ways of just darkening the entire image and keeping the proportion of the tonal range intact. So if I drag this down, for example, to 50, what was 100% white is now 50% white. Actually, that's a little bit extreme. I'll drag it back up to 75. So this is now essentially 3/4 as bright as it was. This is also 3/4 as bright as it was. Same here, same here. So the relative tones, the relative difference between the shadows, the whites, and the highlights and so on are maintained, but the overall image gets darker. Now notice I'm dragging down from the top right and not across, which clips. And we do the opposite then when we want to drag this across. Okay, now should have pointed out there that by doing this, we're darkening the image, but we're not affecting the black point. The black point stays exactly where it is, but everything else comes down towards it. Okay, now the opposite is when we take the bottom left and we lift it up, we change the darkest and everything else gets brighter, but the white point stays where it is. Okay, so this is often called a lift because we're lifting the colors up and we're changing the darkest parts to be brighter, and everything else in between that and white stays proportionally the same. Now, two more to get through before we're done with this. So we've custom adjustments and we've got invert, which is the same as a negative. So a custom adjustment is just where you're clicking in various parts and you're moving based on whatever you need to do to the image. So if I take an exact example, if I click here and drag this down, I'm able to change only the brightest parts of the image. I can click and drag that in just to straighten it up. And what we have now is we've got a regular curve until we get to the brightest parts, and then we're taking them down a little bit. You can see it again in the window. It's a little bit unnatural looking, but it's just to illustrate the point. Now this is just one example, so we might also want to darken the shadows. So we might want to take that down. But we might want to take the very darkest part and lift it up. So the point I'm making is that you can make any change you need across the curve depending on what it is that you need to do. But just bear in mind that when you start forcing the curve into these awkward angles, things are going to start looking a little bit weird. Okay, and I have it switched off. Wait for it. Boom. So it just looks really nasty and flat there, for example, because I've done this. But the idea here is that we can change by clicking and dragging. And again, if we have a point we don't want, we just click and throw it away. Now, the last one we'll look at is what's called invert. And this is the same as getting a negative. Okay, so what I might do is get another color correction here, which you're probably familiar with, called hue and saturation. I'm going to drag it up to the top, and I'm going to drag the saturation down. So we just have a black and white image, so that when we do our negative, it's going to be easy to understand. So to do an invert, I take the black, turn it to white, take the white, and I change it to black. So now what was black is white, and vice versa, so we have effectively a negative. Now this will look like a color negative when we switch off our hue and saturation, and now you can see something a little bit like you would have seen back in the day when you're bringing your film to be developed in the chemist. Okay, so that is the RGB curves, and the next video is going to look at how we can adjust the channels independently of each other.